I'm Dan Schneier. He's Dave Richard. And these are the four biggest mysteries of the 2025 season on Fantasy Football Today Express. Let's dive into these bad boys, Dave. I know you and I have been pretty much headfirst in just draft stuff, but we got to talk 2025 fantasy football season. I want to start with this one because it's a fun one. How high up in round one do you believe is too high for Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr. if you want to draft these two players?
I don't think they should be considered among like the top 5 picks, Dan, but they're don't be surprised if they're round one picks in full PPR leagues. The most recent mock draft that we did, we were both in it. We saw them go at the 12-13 turn. Thomas a spot ahead of Malik Nabers. And it's interesting, and this is where I'm going to throw it back at you, Dan. You took Christian McCaffrey over both of these receivers in the first round. Somebody else in the draft took Tyreek Hill over both of these receivers. Somebody else took Nico Collins. Heath took Puka Nacua. I'm not going to ask you to necessarily argue Christian McCaffrey over Thomas and Nabers, but maybe those other players, Tyreek, Nico, Puka, in your mind, could any of them get leapfrogged by either Thomas or Nabers, depending on what happens in the draft?
I would say it's possible. I think Nico's the one that stands out to me, just given some of the uncertainty with the injury situation with the Texans. I know Christian Kirk is there, but I don't know exactly how fast he'll ingratiate himself in that offense. And Nico's per game numbers were absurd, especially yards per route run. I think he's an evolving player. As far as the others, I don't know if I would make the case. I mean, we don't have to get into it, but for me, McCaffrey is a cheat code when healthy. So you're just getting league winning upside there. So I would take him still. But yeah, I think when it comes down to the draft is, look, if the Giants draft Travis Hunter, and something comes out and they say, we're going to play him at wide receiver, will that change Malik Nabers' outlook? Sure. But there's nothing really that can happen outside of that for either of those two teams that should change their target upside that much. So, yeah, I'm locked in there. Let's move on to another one. I want to figure out what's going on with this Dolphins offense as we head into 2025. I have much higher expectations, I think, than most, Dave. And I think a lot of that depends on what they do on the offensive line in the draft. They've already started that process in free agency. But can Tyreek Waddle and De'Von Achane actually coexist as fantasy contributors? And what would have to happen for that to be the case?
I think the targets would have to be concentrated. I think Achane would have to see an even bigger chunk of the rushing workload. And I'd like to think that would happen, and I would have said that last year. And then what did we see? We know that Tyreek Hill played through a wrist injury. I think that bothered him more than anybody really wants to lead on from Miami. Waddle underperformed. Jonnu Smith became a big-time part of that offense in a role that easily could have gone to Jaylen Waddle. Achane is the one that was the most consistent, over 17 PPR points per game, over 13 non-PPR points per game. And he was even better in matchups when Tua was starting compared to all the other games. Remember, Tua missed a bunch of games. That's another factor. Tua's got to play 17 games. That offensive line should be better. And these guys have to see concentrated targets. And until we see that, I think we're taking risks more so with the receivers than the running back. I know that Achane, where did he go in our most recent mock? Dan, he went 17th overall. Tyreek Hill went 8th overall. That might flip by the time we get to August. And then Waddle in this draft that we did, 71st overall. That's bargain territory for somebody like Jaylen Waddle and the upside that he has.
What's crazy, Dave, is we heard last offseason Mike McDaniel warn us, look, things aren't going to be as concentrated in the passing game. We saw it actually play out. Now we're kind of hoping goes back. Let's go to another offense that disappointed last season with not the exact same, but very similar scheme, very similar ideas. And that's the 49ers offense. Out of that entire 49ers offense, can we expect them to bounce back this year? And like, if we do, now that Deebo Samuel's gone, Ayuk is coming off the injury, which wide receiver do you believe is best positioned to be the bounce to help them become that bounce back team?
Well, first, let me just mention that Jauan, Jennings, Brandon Ayuk, Ricky Pearsall almost went back to back to back in our most recent mock draft, and they all went in round 7. So that just tells me that no one's really confident about any one of these guys being a huge breakout and a huge target getter in the 49ers offense. And I do worry about how this 49ers offense will operate. Can they be as good as they were 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I'm a little nervous about that. I want to see how this offensive line comes together. I've got to have some concern about Christian McCaffrey being available for 17 games. And even though the offense didn't look terrible with Garendo at running back, it does change the tenor of things when you don't have somebody like Christian McCaffrey
Sure.
on the field. That being said, I think the receiver that went last of the three is the one I want to target, and that's Pearsall. Second year wideout. We know that those types of receivers, especially first round guys, can make a jump from year one to year two. I think he's a good route runner. I think he's physical. I think he's got good speed. And hopefully there's nothing that's going to hold him back this year that held him back last year. Obviously thinking not just of his health, but just his overall well-being. I think Pearsall does have upside to be the most complete receiver of the three. Yeah, maybe. I think he probably can have the best all-around game. Jennings, much more of a physical wide receiver. Ayuk, a speedy wide receiver who's coming off of a torn ACL. That's the one who worries me the most. It's just a matter of whether or not Pearsall can put it all together. And if he can, he'll lead this team in targets. And that's something fantasy managers would love to pick up in round 7.
I think I would agree with you on the ceiling of those three, though I will say that for what Brock Purdy does well, and he once spoke about this in an interview, he loves using it. His whole game is anticipatory throwing, and he said the outside the numbers area of the field is really the most untested area by a lot of quarterbacks, and he's willing to test it. Jennings runs the best outbreaking routes on this roster, and they had incredible rapport. So I think he actually has the safest floor. Jennings is the guy I'm going for of these three because I do also like his ceiling, just given their rapport. But I got one more for you, and I can ask you this, Dave, and we'll end on this only because our resident ageist, Jamie Eisenberg, is not with us today, and he can't get, you can actually find some hope in these players. So of the 31-plus-year-old wide receivers, nobody wants to draft these old receivers, despite some of them producing still. Who's the safest? I don't mean who has the highest floor, but who's the safest? Tyreek Hill, Davante Adams, Mike Evans are all 31-plus. Calvin Ridley, who's older than anyone can even realize, Cooper Kupp, and Stefon Diggs in his new home. Who's the
and you're asking who the safest one is for fantasy this year. It's funny because we had the conversation about 30-plus-year-old running backs on the main show where we talked about 5 biggest mysteries. And so it makes sense that you would ask this. This is a good question. I think it's Adams. I don't love that answer. But I can't help but fall in love with the role that he's going to be in with the Rams. You want to talk about concentrated targets. I think he's going to have a lot of them. I think he'll see north of 8 targets per game. I think he's going to replace Cooper Kupp as the red zone guy for the Rams. And I think he can pick up a lot of touchdowns as well. He's got to stay healthy, and speed isn't part of his repertoire like it used to be. I think I feel best about him. That being said, if Tyreek Hill is right and if Tua is right, then the one with the most upside, and you didn't ask me about upside, you asked me who was the safest. The one with the most upside is Tyreek Hill. I can't get on board with Tyreek as a first-round pick like he was in our most recent mock, but maybe round 2 by the time we get to August. If he's really fine, then he would be certainly in that range of players I would take with like a top 20 pick. Davante Adams went 52nd in this draft. That feels a little late in full PPR. I think I'd rather have him. Evans went 35th. That seems a little too soon for me, just because I'm not sure how much longer. I certainly can't expect him to average over 17 PPR points per game. He's been around 15 in the years prior to 2024. And with Godwin back in Tampa, I think that's a realistic expectation. Put me down for Adams ahead of Evans right now. So maybe Adams ends up being like a round 3-4 turn type of wide receiver, and Evans goes a full round after that.
He's Dave Richard. I'm Dan Schneier. And these are the 4 biggest mysteries. Our goal, our attempt at least, at trying to unpack some of them as we head into the draft and the 2025 fantasy football season.